Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. I'm Tom Schwartz, the director, and I'm pleased to open this important conference examining the many humanitarian efforts created in response to World War I. As many of you know, Herbert Hoover's moniker, the Great Humanitarian, had its origins in his efforts to help stranded Americans safely return home at the outbreak of the war, as well as his creation for the Commission for Relief in Belgium that provided food for millions of non-combatants in German-occupied Belgium and northern France. I hope you take time during your visit here today to explore the temporary exhibit, The Making of the Great Humanitarian, Herbert Hoover in World War I, as well as walk to the Belgian village just outside the museum to learn more about this significant historical event. I'd like to recognize the vital support for this program and all our programs by the Hoover Presidential Foundation. They make all of these conferences and temporary exhibits possible. If you are not a member, I hope you will pick up a membership brochure, which is on the table just outside the auditorium, and consider adding your support. I also want to thank C-SPAN for being here today, making this conference available to a wider audience. And I would be remiss for not reminding everyone to silence all of your electronic devices now, as a courtesy for the speakers and other members of the audience. At this time, I would like to introduce Matthew Schaefer, archivist at the Hoover Library Museum. Matt is the organizer of this event, having assisted all the panelists in their various research projects that are reflected in today's conference. I'm constantly amazed at Matt's encyclopedic knowledge of the manuscript collections and his unfailing enthusiasm for assisting researchers in advancing our understanding of Herbert Hoover and his times. Here to introduce our speakers is Matt Schaefer.
Thank you, Tom. It is my very great pleasure to introduce the speakers today who will present. I've known them all for quite some time. Now, at my age, quite some time means some indefinite number of years between 5 and 10. I met each as they came to the Hoover Library to do research on varied aspects of the Commission for Relief of Belgium. And now, I'm thrilled to introduce them and give them a chance to share what they've learned with you. I sometimes lead tours in the galleries here. I led one this morning. When I get to the World War I era and talk about the CRB, I speak of Hoover feeding millions, Hoover organizing, Hoover, Hoover, Hoover. And perhaps understandably, it's the Hoover Presidential Library. But even as I'm giving this speech, I realize I'm doing a disservice to the hundreds of Americans and thousands of Europeans who formed the boots on the ground, if you will, for the Commission of Relief of Belgium. These four folks have studied, each of those people have a story, thousands of stories. And these four have made a study of that, and they're going to share them with you today. Tom Westerman, our third speaker, came to the Hoover Library on a Hoover Foundation grant while working on his PhD at UConn. The research laid the groundwork for his article, Touring Occupied Belgium, American Humanitarians at Work and Leisure. Tom puts a human face on humanitarians. Often when I think of humanitarians, I think of this sort of ethereal, larger than life, bigger, better than human people. And Tom talks about these as men, young men who are now across the water for the first time, and in addition to doing their food relief work, are just tourists and engaging with the Belgian community in many different ways. He points out their youth, their progressive optimism, and their eventual transition from young men into a proficient professional overseeing food relief. He argues in this article and proves to me that CRB forged for these men a new identity, Hoover men. They were Hoover men then, and they were Hoover men until the day they died. Bound by this common experience, they are always part of Hoover's inner circle. And to close the final link in this chain is Tom himself was a Belgian-American Education Foundation scholar, spent a year in Belgium studying as postgraduate?
For my doctorate.
First doctorate. The BAF Fellows was created out of the remaining money left when the CRB disincorporated in 1920. It was Hoover's idea at that time to set up an exchange program to bring Belgian scholars to America and American scholars to Belgium. And it's gone on for 95 years, I don't do math in my head very well, and has assisted almost 4,000 scholars in those 95 years.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you again for Matt and for Tom for organizing this wonderful seminar talking about the CRB men and their relationship to World War I. And it's an honor to be here at the Hoover Presidential Library, where I first started doing my research for my dissertation in January of 2005. It was bitterly, bitterly cold, and Matt lent me an extra pair of gloves, which I have since lost, so sorry. And so you're not going to get those back, but it's great to come back here when it's a little bit warmer. So the title of my talk, which is the most effective human angels I've ever known, comes not from me. That's not my statement about these, although they are angelic in many, many ways. But it comes from what Herbert Hoover said about one of his friends and colleagues, Morris Pate, who Brandon introduced us to a little bit earlier on today. At a dinner in 1956, Hoover called Pate, quote, "the most efficient and dedicated human angel that I have ever known." And this is great praise coming from someone who spent a great deal of his life working in the realm of humanitarian relief, and is often called, and literally is called here, the great humanitarian. And I figured it would be an apt statement to adapt for the symposium dedicated to examining the various personalities who were part of this humanitarian awakening during World War I. A moment which launched the careers of Hoovermen, and I take that term Hoovermen from Hal Wirt, the historian Hal Wirt. Public careers of men like Hoover and Pate. Hoover's story obviously is the better known of all of this, and the stories of men like Pate and those from Jeff's presentation are not, but thankfully there are a number of new scholars who are writing about these, including Brandon, Jeff, Tammy, myself, Jen Polk, Michael McGuire, Julia Irwin, who have begun to uncover and explore the lives and activities of those involved with American-led humanitarian work during World War I. So I first came to know Morris Pate here at the Hoover Library in January of 2005. Well, the bulk of his material is at Princeton University. The Hoover Presidential Library has copies of a lot of his papers, in particular copies of his diary, which is a fantastic exploration of what life was like on the ground as a member of the CRB. And his diary, like the diaries and letters and correspondence of many other members of the CRB, provide important insights into the lived experience of the men who worked for the CRB and would later continue their humanitarian work in places like Poland and Finland after World War I and World War II. So, like Jeff kind of done, I'm going to talk about a few of the individuals, mainly Morris Pate, kind of those featured strongly in here, and their experiences in Belgium while they worked for the CRB. And I want to talk about these gentlemen in two distinct but related ways. First, as spectators of the war, but then also as witnesses of what was going on, especially what the Germans were doing, in particular this crisis of deportations which occurred in late 1916 and early 1917. And so the American Spectator's part comes from an article I published that Brandon guest edited, and Tammy also has an article in the First World War Studies. And the issue of witnessing comes from my dissertation. I hope to show that while these young men were obviously dedicated humanitarian agents, they had a complex relationship with their work as neutral Americans in a war zone and as international humanitarians confronting new and unsettling situations at the hands of the occupying Germans. In very real ways, then, their activities in Belgium not only awakened their own humanitarian spirit, but also helped propel them and the United States, and the idea, more importantly, the idea of the United States, onto the world stage in the early 20th century as a national agent of humanitarian activity. So Pate and his fellow delegates lived literally in a theater of war. Belgium was an active theater of war. In addition to their participatory role as humanitarians, they were also spectators to one of the greatest calamities in human history. They experienced the war by seeing and absorbing the sights and the sounds of the conflict, and they reflected on their experiences and the different people they encountered along the way. And Jeff explain that greatly, oftentimes falling in love with Belgian women and marrying them. And so that's one different way to engage, literally, with Belgium and the Belgian people. And again, as Jeff said, these men came from highly educated backgrounds, like Princeton, Yale, Harvard, Stanford. There's a huge West Coast contingent, mainly because of Hoover's association with Stanford University, where he got his undergraduate mining degree. So there are a very specific type of people. And in fact, one delegate named Francis Wick wrote of them as Anglo-Saxons of the Western world. They saw themselves as these exceptional men of the United States and the Anglo-Saxon nature of the world. And so they came to Belgium to witness the spectacle of war, in addition to conducting their aid initiatives. They constructed a humanitarian identity for themselves to comprehend the war and their place in it. This new identity was shaped by their American-induced neutrality and the amorphous space they inhabited in Belgium. They were neither combatants nor victims, neither occupied nor occupiers. Their official role as neutral arbiters of relief aid was complemented and complicated by their informal role as travelers and tourists, in many ways, in a strange land amid strange situations. For the first time in nearly a generation, Americans like Pate were experiencing war firsthand, complete with all its sights and sounds. As neutrals, they tried to stand apart from the politics of the war, but they were also very much part of the day-to-day life of civilians working in a distressed land. So Pate himself was about 22 when he joined the CRB. He applied to work for Hoover's commission out of Princeton University, using his experience in the American Red Cross. He said, hey, listen, I can do this kind of work. He had a letter of reference from Princeton's president, John G. Hibben. And even though his French was not up to the mark at all, he was allowed into the CRB organization. There was always an exception for a good Anglo-Saxon of the Western world. So in his diary, Pate juxtaposes the day-to-day work of a humanitarian administrator. He has meetings with officials, especially the Germans, finding ways to make sure everyone has enough food, sometimes resorting to have more and more. Belgium eat something called black bread, which was nutritionally not great, did not taste all that good, but had to be fed to everyone, upper class and lower class as well. And so there's a lot of things about, in terms of class relationships in Belgium, how the relief effort kind of collapses some of those issues. So Pate, like all the delegates, took his job very seriously and worked quite hard in these difficult circumstances. But he and the other delegates were not immune to the vibrant world around them. Belgium was and is a beautiful country, unlike what they had in the United States in many ways. So in October of 1916, he wrote in his diary, quote, of a beautiful airplane raid during the morning. The sky was perfectly blue, except for a few very high white clouds. Several bombs were dropped, bursting with a deep intonation. These were answered by a steady fire of German guns. The greater part of the time, the planes were hidden by white clouds, reappearing now and then at clear spaces, and thus giving a very picturesque effect. Pate's language in his diary entry evoked an air performance show as much as it did a dangerous and violent air raid. Pate's war involved more than just the daily drudgery of ledgers and distribution lists and meetings. It also spoke of a spectacle of modern technology and sensory experience like none he had experienced before. These men who worked for Hoover were present at the creation of the modern world of humanitarian practices, as Brandon mentioned before. They were seeing firsthand the new way of war and filtering these ideas through the prism of their self-constructed American identity as neutrals in this new humanitarian endeavor, especially when they would observe the Germans up close in terms of what they were doing at that time. And so again, from Pate's diary, just not too far away from the beautiful air raid explanation we had before. To see them, the German army, drill or make arms at rest is a marvel. It is a perfect machine, lacking only individuality. Pate here had a front row seat to the spectacle of the German army itself. It was perfect, he said, except for its lack of individuality, a key, as we all know well, key American trait, a key American identity. And so this spectacle, this spectatorship that he had, was a prelude in many ways for deeper engagement by Americans during the occupation. that would raise more and more questions about not only their role as humanitarians, but the proper role of what a humanitarian should do in a theater of war. How far could they go? How far could their neutrality be challenged before it broke and they did something that might involve them having to be removed from the situation? So, So Herbert Hoover's humanitarian mission relied obviously on his and his men's neutrality. Their job was to solicit and then distribute the food to their Belgian counterparts, and not necessarily involve themselves in the affairs of the German occupation. Of course, Pate and others frequently recorded instances of when they, as CRB members and Americans, played some role in aiding the Belgians for this or that potential abuse, trying to get some sort of restitution. And they often use their status as members of the CRB and also as Americans as honest brokers, something President Woodrow Wilson was hoping to do by keeping the United States neutral. So on a smaller scale, they were achieving in some ways what Wilson tried to do on a larger scale. What happens then when that neutrality was put to the test by what today we would call gross human rights violations? So here we now come to how men acted as witnesses, not just spectators, but witnesses during their time in the Belgian occupation. So I want to turn briefly for the remainder of my talk to a moment in late 1916, early 1917, when Hoover's human angels of humanitarianism were confronted with the mass deportation of Belgian men in their capacity as potential labor to Germany. These deportations, which was an orchestrated program by the Germans in October of 1916, violated decades-old international law that forbade the compulsion of the population of an occupied territory to take part in military operations against its own country. These are in the Hague Conventions of the day. This action by the German government then eventually moved some 60,000 Belgian men forcibly from Belgium to Germany, which outraged international observers like the CRB, as well as the United States, including the Wilson administration. Hoover's humanitarian angels were on-the-ground witnesses to these abuses and recorded what they saw and experienced for posterity. After the war, another delegate, Robert Withington, wrote that the news of these deportations, quote, came like a storm approaching from the west. The grief and sorrow and fear of the deportation spread over the land. These deportations by train were coordinated projects by the German army and government, which were desperate for workers back home in Germany to replace the men who were called up to the front. And historians like Isabella Hall, Larry Zuckerman, David Watts, and others have seen in some ways this Belgian deportations as precursors to World War II era deportations of, again, Belgians, but also in some ways to the way the Holocaust would play itself out in terms of removing people en masse by train from one place to another. Withington also expressed the dilemma that he and the rest of his CRB fellow members faced. It was hard, he wrote, not to be able to help the people who had looked up to the Americans with a trust rarely one finds save in dumb beasts. But we had to remember that we were in Belgium for the relief effort alone, and that we had no interest in the deportations unless they affected our own men. So while in one way he's quite patronizing toward the Belgians and calling them dumb beasts, and there was this element of they are our children, we are taking care of them, again, that idea of American exceptionalism, American progress, American betterment, even though Belgium was a highly industrialized country, had a very large imperial presence in Africa, the Belgian Congo, a key railroad center there. It was something that after the war, the leveling of Belgium, of Louvain and elsewhere, kind of taken it back to a quote medieval state and seen it as something no longer modern. But he recognized that there was a compelling interest to intervene some way, but also noted that there was no way of doing so without putting the broader humanitarian work at risk. And this is still today, a key question in debates over humanitarianism versus human rights philosophies. So he expressed the tension between ameliorative humanitarianism, helping the immediate problem without thinking about necessarily long-term political issues, and restorative or preventative human rights, which is legalistic and more directly political. So the CRB and its delegates were acting as agents of humanitarianism, not human rights per se. But they could act, and they did act, as witnesses of these human rights violations. So in this way, the Americans were awakened to the reality of the immense suffering of World War I and of humanity around the world during wartime, in a time when America is theoretically neutral during the war. Though the American sense of absolute neutrality had been challenged frequently during their time in Belgium, the German deportation of Belgian laborers, which led to increased tensions with the Wilson administration in the run-up to eventually America coming into the war in April 1917, was a serious and painful challenge to their identity as humanitarians. They could step in and protest the deportation policy of the Germans and jeopardize broader relief efforts by maybe being asked to leave because they were doing bad work in the eyes of the Germans. Or they could advocate only for those Belgians who worked in some capacity for the CRB or for the CM, Comité National. About 50,000 or so, I think that's the right number. Belgians worked in some capacity for the CRB. They were the ones who actually did the distribution of the food. The Americans supervised to make sure there was nothing shady going on. Black market stuff, Germans taking things, Belgians hoarding. It was the Belgians themselves who did the actual distribution. So they were in one way working for the relief effort, even if they were unemployed, in that they weren't working for, say, the Belgian economy in a way that would be more traditional before the war. So at the time, the CRB, under Hoover's orders, chose to play a limited role in observing the actions of the Germans. And it's a great example of the difficult nature of the work Hoover's men endured during their time in Belgium. So while Hoover and his colleagues were rightly disturbed by the German policy, the CRB judged, again, this as a political problem that was not up to them to solve, and thus beyond the scope of the commission. Hoover, though, did write the U.S. minister in Belgium, Brand Whitlock, in November of 1917, informing him of the situation. Whitlock did then report this back to the State Department, and eventually does get back to Woodrow Wilson. So there is a conduit of news coming from, in theory, a verifiable, trusted source in Belgium, not just rumors in papers or other agendas, but again, this neutral agency informing what's going on the ground in Belgium. And Whitlock agreed with Herbert Hoover that making too much of an official protest might harm the relief effort, and the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, as hard as that might have been. So after both World War I and World War II, another delegate named Francis Wicks, who I mentioned before, said in an interview that he was, quote, present for the purpose of protesting against some of these transactions, where the young men were brought in by the soldiers and put into confined areas, and then loaded like cattle into freight cars and carried off to Germany for forced labor. The Americans' protests were primarily for any man who had some sort of employment for the CRB, or the Comité National. So early on, just as the policy was getting underway, Pate also, again, recorded in his diary, the CRB office in a city or region was often, quote, the headquarters of the ministerial protectorate of the United States and Spain, the arbiter of the enforcement of the international laws of The Hague, and general cure for all evils. His reference there to Spain is the Spanish and the Dutch were also neutral at the time, and they had honorary chairmanship on the CRB's board. Later, after when the Americans would leave, when they became involved in the war militarily in April of 17, the Spanish and the Dutch would take over in many ways, running kind of the day-to-day operations, even though Hoover still had a very heavy hand on what the CRB was doing. And so, they see themselves in this particular role as a protectorate of those when they possibly can do it. So a few days after writing that down, Pate recorded that he was asked directly about 30 men from Tournai who had refused to work in the aviation field and were conducted as prisoners to the station and started on their way to Germany. Pate continues in his diary that a new poster placed today announces more serious penalties unless necessary workmen are forthcoming. The Germans would give an ultimatum to a city: you need to give us 500 laborers on Saturday. If you don't do that, we're going to charge you 10,000 francs per citizen restitution to us. So it was kind of this ransom for people. So even though the actual procurement, transport, reception, fair distribution of food, the CRB's raison d'etre, was at this point well-founded, well-respected, and efficiently run, for men like Pate, they were trying to deal with, well, now, as he writes in his diary, the biggest question now was the wholesale requisition of civilians for forced military work, as opposed to the issue of requisition of potential food during this time, even though they couldn't do a whole lot when necessary. So how much the Americans could or would do was always in question. Personal intervention by a delegate was always a tactic, and they used it frequently to make sure that people weren't getting deported that should not have been. But the CRB eventually settled on a policy of giving CRB identification cards to many Belgian workers. Now, this didn't happen all over Belgium. Some provinces would do this. Others would only kind of do it retroactively if they were kind of being taken. And others were like, actually, we don't have to do this. They're trusting us. So even though the CRB was very centralized, again, individuality. A lot of American delegates could do some things differently in provinces, depending on what their relationship was. But these ID cards became very important. And the Americans reported that, at the beginning at least, and in general, the Germans did respect these cards. But as time went on, the respect kind of was uneven and kind of went by the wayside. And then the Americans worked on a more kind of on-the-ground element to try to get the Belgians not deported. So Pate did record some successes in stopping the deportations of some Belgians. Of course, many were forced to go, resulting in strains between some Belgians and Americans, that the Americans were not doing enough. And Whitlock recorded in his own records in January of 1917 that at times he felt, quote, "The Belgians now detest the Americans as much as anybody because the United States does not go to war over the deportations." And so this was an organization that was on board with the Belgians, but now this new thing is filling in that vacuum, filling that space, and the Americans aren't doing enough, and this is the problem. So indeed, war with Germany would come only in a few more months. But until then, the American CRBs would have to do their best, at least to protect the Belgians that they could, and who had provided good and loyal service to the relief program. The Americans of Belgium drew on their power as members of the CRB in doing this. For instance, Antwerp, Gardner Richardson reported back to his superiors that, quote, "The CRB employment cards that have been issued have been uniformly respected. And as yet, we have no cases to report of CRB employees having been taken to Germany." In those later cases, however, when the cards that indicated a person worked for the CRB were not respected, the delegates could and did make personal individual interventions. For instance, again, Richardson, just after saying that, had to do something. He had to speak with the German officials personally to allow 33 Belgians whose cards indicating that their CRB service began on October 15th, 1916, just around when this policy was coming into effect of these deportations. The Germans saw this as too smooth, that this is too convenient, so these cards were not going to be respected. But Richardson, and he took this critique to heart. He got those 33 to come back, but he said, listen, we need to make sure we're not abusing these cards. We need to use them rightly. We need to use them properly, so we don't ignore it altogether. So again, making these very, very hard decisions about who goes and who stays, rested on the shoulders of these Americans who went over there just to work on food, but now have to work on something much, much larger. The delegates, through their diaries and letters and reports that they've sent back, report on the often arbitrary nature of the German seizure of Belgian laborers. And they were, because the Germans were often under pressure to meet quotas. The Americans proved to be an important source of information. Hoover himself reported to the United States Secretary of State about the German actions and found the policy reprehensible himself, but once noted again that the open action for us as such would jeopardize other protections which we can give the Belgian people for relief. The deportation scheme ended in February of 1917, just as tensions between the United States and Germany over the resumption of unrestricted civil warfare were coming to an end, coming to a head, leading to the end of the CRB's American component. With American entry into the war in April 1917, the American direct leadership of the CRB came to an end, and the Spanish and Dutch would take over. The stories of these men who then returned to the United States, some joining the Army and serving back in Europe in a military capacity, can be found in places like here, the Hoover Library, in their papers, oral histories, and other collections. Men like Pate would go on to spend the rest of their lives serving in humanitarian capacities around the world. Hoover and some of his colleagues would tour Europe at the behest of President Truman, as Brandon said before, to assess food capabilities during World War II. Pate, as I said earlier, went on to become the first director of UNICEF, holding that position until his death in January of 1965. These men were products of their age, young and inquisitive about the world, but they saw firsthand the toll war could take on civilians, and worked diligently then and later in their lives to bring some semblance of relief and protection to those they felt had the best chance of protecting. They made hard decisions, but kept their eyes open to not only the spectacle around them, but to the abuses they often felt powerless to confront fully. By the time the Americans left the CRB's service, those who served went from being merely adventurous good Americans to seasoned humanitarians, ready for action, if and when called upon in the U.S. or world circumstances. Their work with the CRB established the United States and its citizens as leaders in humanitarian power. The history of the American delegates of the CRB evinces a history of American action in the world that, to quote the late Gary Clifford, tried to use a Hoover alternative on the world stage during the 20th century. Thank you very much.